In the United States today, history is no longer just something found in textbooks, archives, or museum halls. It has become a living political battleground playing out in public view. The way Americans remember their past, the stories they choose to highlight, and the ones they choose to downplay are now at the center of a national debate about identity, patriotism, and truth. Questions that once belonged mostly to historians and educators — how should slavery be taught? How should indigenous history be presented? What do monuments really represent? — are now part of everyday political conversation. The past is no longer distant. It is being actively interpreted, debated, and reshaped in the present. Since returning to office, President Donald Trump has pushed a major effort to reshape how federal institutions present American history, arguing that many museums, memorials, and parks had drifted into what he calls divisive or ideological storytelling. According to this view, public history had become too focused on America's failures, conflicts, and injustices, creating a narrative that, in the eyes of supporters, weakened national pride and unity. The goal, they argue, is to restore a version of history that emphasizes achievement, resilience, and what they describe as the exceptional nature of the American experiment. Supporters of these changes see this effort as a necessary correction, a way to bring balance back to public storytelling and to present history in a way that unites rather than divides. They believe national institutions should inspire pride and a shared sense of identity, especially as the country approaches major milestones like its 250th anniversary. To them, history should be a source of cohesion, not conflict. Critics, however, view the situation very differently. They argue that focusing only on pride and achievement risks rewriting history by removing uncomfortable but essential parts of the country's story. They warn that history loses its meaning when it becomes selective, and that avoiding difficult subjects such as slavery, segregation, displacement of native peoples, and civil rights struggles does not create unity. It creates an incomplete picture of the past. For these critics, acknowledging painful history is not an attack on the nation, but an important part of understanding how it evolved. What was once a quiet academic discussion among historians has now become a visible, public, and deeply political fight over who controls the story of America. Museums, monuments, and national parks are no longer just educational spaces. They have become symbols in a larger cultural debate about how the nation sees itself, what it chooses to remember, and what it chooses to forget. At the center of this shift is Executive Order 14253, titled Restoring Truth and Sanity to American History. Framed by the administration as a corrective measure, the order directs federal cultural institutions, including the Smithsonian Museums, the National Park Service, and numerous historic memorial sites, to review how American history is being presented to the public. Officials argue that some exhibits and educational materials had begun to reflect what they describe as improper ideology or narratives that inappropriately disparage Americans past and present. The stated goal is to ensure that federal institutions present history in a way that promotes unity, national pride, and what the order calls a more balanced portrayal of the American story. Under this directive, institutions were asked to conduct internal reviews of exhibits, signage, educational programming, and even retail materials connected to historical interpretation. Exhibits dealing with slavery, racial injustice, civil rights struggles, climate history, and various social movements have been subject to examination and, in some cases, revision or removal. Interpretive signs in national parks have been rewritten to reflect new guidance. Certain museum displays have been adjusted to align with updated standards. Reports have also noted that gift shop materials and educational resources connected to projects such as the 1619 Project have come under scrutiny as part of this broader review process. Supporters of the order describe it as a necessary effort to prevent public institutions from presenting history through what they see as a narrow or overly critical lens. They argue that federal museums and memorials should highlight the nation's achievements, resilience, and founding principles, rather than emphasizing conflict and division. From this perspective, the order is about restoring confidence in national institutions and ensuring that they reflect a shared American identity rather than political viewpoints. Critics, however, view the directive as one of the most direct federal interventions into historical interpretation in modern U.S. history. They argue that history is inherently complex and that removing or altering content dealing with difficult subjects risks presenting a simplified or selective narrative. Many historians and museum professionals express concern that the order places political influence directly into spaces that have traditionally been guided by scholarship and academic standards. Regardless of where one stands, the order represents a significant moment in how American history is publicly presented. It signals that museums, parks, and memorials are no longer seen as neutral spaces of learning alone, but as places where national identity, memory, and meaning are actively being shaped and debated. Museums and cultural institutions across the country now find themselves in a uniquely difficult position. These are places that have traditionally operated with a degree of scholarly independence, guided by historians, curators, researchers, and educators whose goal has been to present the past as accurately and thoughtfully as possible. But under the new directives, many of these professionals say they are navigating unfamiliar territory, where historical interpretation is no longer shaped by academic consensus alone, but also by political expectations. Curators and historians often argue that history is not simple, comfortable, or easy to present. It involves conflict, injustice, progress, setbacks, and perspectives that can challenge modern audiences. Removing or softening difficult subjects, they say, risks presenting a version of the past that feels cleaner but ultimately incomplete. For them, history's value lies not only in celebrating achievements, but also in understanding mistakes, struggles, and the lessons they carry. At the same time, museum leadership must operate within federal guidelines. This has led to a delicate balancing act. Professionals within these institutions describe walking a fine line between complying with directives and trying to maintain what they see as historical integrity. Some exhibits have been quietly modified with small wording changes that shift emphasis without removing content entirely. In other cases, proposed changes have sparked internal discussions and debates among staff about how far revisions should go and what compromises are acceptable. Behind the scenes, these conversations can be complex and tense. Decisions about labels, descriptions, images, and themes, things most visitors would never notice, now carry greater weight than ever before. What was once a matter of academic editing has become a matter of national attention. For the first time in decades, many federal museums are no longer viewed simply as places of education and preservation. They have become highly visible spaces where political priorities and historical scholarship meet, sometimes uneasily. Visitors walking through exhibits may not realize it, but the stories they read on the walls are now part of a larger national conversation about how America chooses to remember itself. The debate over history does not end inside museum walls. It reaches into the streets, parks, and public squares where monuments stand, or once stood, as visible reminders of how a nation chooses to remember its past. Statues and memorials are not just historical artifacts, they are physical symbols placed in shared spaces, shaping how communities encounter history in everyday life. As a result, they have become some of the most contested elements in the broader struggle over American memory. In recent years, several Confederate-era monuments were removed, relocated, or taken down entirely by local governments, often following public protests and renewed scrutiny of their origins. Supporters of these removals argued that many of these monuments were erected not simply to remember history, but to promote specific political messages, often during periods of racial tension and resistance to civil rights. To them, these statues represented power, exclusion, and a selective version of the past rather than neutral historical remembrance. The current administration has pushed back against these efforts, moving to restore or protect certain monuments and memorials. Officials argue that removing statues amounts to erasing history and replacing it with what they describe as a false reconstruction of the past. From this perspective, monuments, even those tied to controversial figures or causes, serve as reminders of where the nation has been, including its darkest chapters. Preserving them, supporters say, allows Americans to confront history rather than hide from it. Opponents strongly challenge this view. They argue that monuments are not history itself, but interpretations of history, shaped by the values of the time in which they were created. A statue in a place of honor, they say, does more than remember, it elevates. For many critics, keeping certain monuments in prominent public spaces sends a message of endorsement rather than reflection, especially to communities whose ancestors were harmed by the systems those figures defended. As a result, communities across the country are once again divided over what belongs in their shared spaces. Town halls, city councils, and public hearings have become stages for emotional debates about heritage, identity, and belonging. For some residents, monuments represent tradition and ancestry. For others, they represent exclusion and unresolved injustice. These disagreements reveal that the conflict is not simply about stone or bronze, but about whose story is centered and whose is marginalized. At its core, the monument debate exposes a deeper question. Is remembering the past the same as honoring it? And who gets to decide the difference?
As America continues to wrestle with its history, its public spaces have become mirrors of a nation still negotiating the meaning of its past and what values it chooses to place on display for future generations.
All of this is unfolding as the United States approaches its 250th anniversary, a milestone traditionally meant to honor the nation's founding, its survival, and its growth over nearly 3 centuries. Anniversaries like this are usually moments of reflection and celebration, opportunities to tell a unifying story about where a nation has been and where it hopes to go. But as 2026 draws closer, it has become clear that this anniversary will not be simple or uncontested. Instead of a single shared narrative, America finds itself divided over what exactly is being celebrated and what must be acknowledged alongside it. At the center of this tension is a fundamental question: what story will America tell about itself? Will the focus be on unity, patriotism, innovation, and global leadership, the achievements that have shaped national pride? Or will the story also confront the injustices, conflicts, and contradictions that have existed alongside those achievements, from slavery and segregation to displacement, inequality, and political struggle? For some, emphasizing flaws feels like undermining the nation. For others, ignoring them feels like dishonesty. This debate reveals something deeper than policy or politics. It shows that history is not static, it is actively shaped by the present. The way a nation remembers its past reflects how it understands itself today. Museums, monuments, textbooks, and public ceremonies are not just about honoring what happened, they are about deciding what values will be passed on to the next generation. What children learn about their country will influence how they see citizenship, responsibility, and belonging. As the 250th anniversary approaches, the fight over museums, monuments, and memory has become a fight over identity itself. It is a struggle over whether America defines itself by a polished image or a complex truth, and whether unity comes from shared pride alone or from a shared willingness to confront history honestly. The outcome of this moment will not just shape a celebration in 2026, it will shape how America understands its past and how it imagines its future. Public discourse around the anniversary is already highlighting the tensions between commemoration and critique. Efforts to organize celebrations, parades, exhibitions, and educational programs are being accompanied by calls for inclusion, apology, and accountability. Communities that have historically been marginalized are demanding that their stories not be footnotes, but central to the national narrative. Indigenous peoples, descendants of enslaved Africans, immigrants, and other groups are insisting that acknowledgement of their struggles and contributions be inseparable from the story of national progress. The anniversary, they argue, cannot be fully celebrated without confronting the ways in which the nation has fallen short of its founding ideals. At the same time, there is a broader conversation about the nature of patriotism itself. Is love of country shown only through celebration, or does it also require critique and reflection? For many, true patriotism involves grappling with difficult truths, recognizing injustice, and working to build a more equitable future. Others fear that focusing on mistakes and oppression diminishes pride and weakens national cohesion. The tension between these views is playing out in classrooms, media, and public forums, revealing how deeply Americans disagree not just on history, but on what it means to belong to a nation. Ultimately, the 250th anniversary may be less about reaching consensus and more about embracing complexity. It is an opportunity for the United States to show that national identity need not be reduced to slogans or sanitized stories. Instead, it can reflect both triumph and tragedy, courage and compromise, progress and failure. How Americans navigate this balance will determine not only the tone of the anniversary, but the lessons that will endure for generations. In facing history with honesty, the nation may discover that a more honest understanding of its past is not a threat to unity, but a foundation for a deeper, more resilient sense of community and purpose.